dark and glorifying history of Boston, Massachusetts. Boston is one of the most historic cities in America. It calls itself the birthplace of the American Revolution, a city of patriots, rebellion, freedom. But behind the glory, there's something darker. Executions in public parks, religious extremism, mob violence, political riots, racial tension that shook the entire country. Boston didn't just help create America, it helped shape its chaos. This is the dark and glorifying history of Boston, Massachusetts. Boston was founded in 1630 by English Puritans, led by John Winthrop. They believed they were chosen by God to build what Winthrop famously called a city upon a hill, a model society, a holy community that the world would look up to. But this model society came with strict control. The Puritans demanded religious conformity. Church attendance wasn't optional. Disagreeing with leadership could get you banished. Anne Hutchinson challenged church authority in the 1630s. She held meetings in her home and questioned ministers. For that, she was put on trial and expelled from the colony. Roger Williams criticized the union of church and state. He too was banished. The people who fled England, seeking religious freedom, quickly denied it to others. Boston's foundation was built on faith, but also on fear. Punishment in early Boston was public and brutal. Today, Boston Common is peaceful. People walk dogs there. Families picnic there. But in the 1600s and 1700s, it was a site of execution. Hangings were public events. Crowds gathered to watch. Criminals were whipped in front of neighbors. Some were branded with hot irons. Others were locked in wooden stocks so the public could mock them. Justice was not quiet. It was theatrical. It was meant to send a message. Step out of line, and everyone will see what happens. Then came one of the darkest chapters in Massachusetts history, the witch trials. While the most infamous executions happened in Salem in 1692, Boston was deeply connected to the panic. Religious paranoia spread across the colony. More than 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 19 were executed by hanging. One man was pressed to death with heavy stones after refusing to enter a plea. The hysteria was fueled by fear, superstition, and rigid religious authority. And Boston was at the center of that authority. It was a moment when faith turned into something terrifying. But Boston would soon shift from religious extremism to political rebellion. By the 1760s, tensions between colonists and the British government were rising. Taxes were imposed. British soldiers were stationed in the city. Many Bostonians hated their presence. On March 5, 1770, a crowd gathered around a group of British soldiers. Insults were shouted, snowballs were thrown, ice and debris hit the troops. The situation escalated. Then shots were fired. 5 colonists were killed. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere created an engraving that showed British soldiers firing in a clean line into a helpless crowd. It became powerful propaganda, but the reality was chaotic, confusing, messy. The soldiers were later defended in court by John Adams, who would become the second president of the United States. He believed in fair trials, even for enemies. The Boston Massacre became a symbol of tyranny, but it was also a reminder of how quickly mobs and fear can turn deadly. Then came the Boston Tea Party. In 1773, colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. It was a protest against taxation without representation. Today, it's celebrated as heroic defiance. At the time, it was the destruction of private property worth millions in today's dollars. Britain responded harshly. The harbor was shut down. Boston's economy was crippled. The so-called intolerable acts were imposed, and the path to war became inevitable. Boston wasn't just protesting, it was daring an empire to respond, and the empire did. When the Revolutionary War began in 1775, Boston was at the center of it. The battles of Lexington and Concord took place just outside the city. The siege of Boston followed. Colonial forces surrounded British troops for nearly a year. Finally, in 1776, the British evacuated. Boston had helped ignite a revolution. It had challenged the most powerful empire on earth, and it had won. But Boston's darkness didn't end with independence. In the 1800s, the city became a hub for abolitionism. It was home to strong anti-slavery voices. But it was also deeply divided. When escaped enslaved people were captured under the Fugitive Slave Act, Boston saw violent protests. In 1854, Anthony Burns, an escaped slave, was arrested in Boston. Thousands protested. Federal troops were brought in. Burns was marched through the streets under heavy guard. The image shocked the North. Even in a city that claimed moral leadership, injustice was visible. Then came the waves of immigration. Irish immigrants flooded into Boston during the Great Famine in the 1840s. They faced intense discrimination. Signs reading, "No Irish need apply," were common. The city became sharply divided between Protestant elites and poor Catholic immigrants. Violence broke out more than once. Boston was not the unified beacon it liked to portray itself as. It was fractured. In the 20th century, those fractures deepened. In the 1970s, Boston became nationally known for one of the most explosive desegregation crises in American history. Court-ordered school busing was implemented to address segregation. The reaction was furious. Protests erupted. Riots broke out. Students were attacked. National news cameras captured the anger. The city that once claimed to lead the fight for liberty was now shown struggling with racial equality. It was a painful chapter, one that still shapes Boston's identity today. And then, in 2013, Boston faced modern terror. The Boston Marathon bombing killed 3 people and injured hundreds. The manhunt that followed shut down the entire city. For days, Boston stood still. But something else happened. The phrase "Boston Strong" emerged. The city united. Strangers helped strangers. Communities came together. It was a reminder that while Boston has a history of division and conflict, it also has resilience. That resilience may be the most defining part of its story. Boston is not a simple city. It is not just tea in a harbor. It is not just Paul Revere's ride. It is not just championships and universities. It is a city born in religious control, forged in rebellion, shaped by immigration, tested by racial conflict, and strengthened through tragedy. Its history is dark. Its history is glorifying. And like America itself, it is complicated. Boston calls itself the birthplace of freedom. But freedom, as its history shows, has never come easily. It has been loud, violent, messy, and deeply human. And that is the real story of Boston, Massachusetts.